The grand lobby of the corporate headquarters gleamed with polished marble floors and towering glass walls. The air smelled of expensive cologne and fresh coffee, the scent of success. Employees in sleek suits and high heels walked with confidence, their conversations filled with numbers, deals, and deadlines. A man in simple, worn-out clothes stepped inside. He didn't carry a briefcase, nor did he wear a luxury watch. His shoes were clean but far from designer brands. He took a moment to scan the surroundings, observing everything, the people, the energy, the culture. His face showed no signs of nervousness, just quiet curiosity. He approached the front desk, where a young receptionist sat, typing away on her computer. Without even looking up, she sighed impatiently, as if already annoyed by his presence. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone sharp and uninterested. The man gave a small nod. "I'd like to speak with someone in management." The receptionist finally looked up, her eyes scanning him from head to toe. His plain attire didn't impress her. He didn't look like a businessman, a client, or anyone important. Just another nobody wasting her time. "Do you have an appointment?" she asked, her voice dripping with condescension. "No," he admitted. She smirked. "Then I'm afraid you can't just walk in and demand to see management. This isn't some small shop where you can talk to the owner over the counter." The man remained calm. "I understand. But it's important." She let out a small laugh, shaking her head. "Listen, sir, we don't have time for walk-ins. If you want a job application, check the website." She dismissed him with a wave of her hand and returned to typing, ignoring his presence completely. The man didn't argue. Instead, he stepped aside, finding a seat near the entrance. He watched as the receptionist greeted the next person, a well-dressed businessman. Her tone instantly changed. She smiled brightly, her voice filled with warmth. "Welcome, sir." "Do you have an appointment?" she asked sweetly. He nodded, and she immediately offered him assistance, directing him to the right office. The man sitting nearby observed it all. Minutes passed. More people arrived. Some, like him, were brushed off. Others, those wearing tailored suits and expensive watches, were treated like royalty. A young intern, no older than 20, nervously approached the desk, clutching a folder in her trembling hands. "Excuse me, not now," the receptionist snapped without looking up. "Come back later." The intern hesitated, then turned away, her shoulders slumping. The man watching everything remained silent, but inside, he was taking notes, mentally recording every moment, every action. These people had no idea who he was. And soon, they would regret everything. Here is part 2 of your story. The man remained seated, quietly observing as the receptionist continued her routine, warm smiles for those who looked important, cold indifference for everyone else. Minutes turned into nearly an hour. Still, no one approached him, no one asked if he needed help. He was invisible. He took a slow breath, glancing at the company's logo displayed proudly on the wall. This was supposed to be a place built on values, respect, teamwork, innovation. At least, that's what the mission statement said. But from where he was sitting, reality was something entirely different. A well-dressed executive walked by, scrolling through his phone. The man raised a hand slightly. "Excuse me," the executive barely glanced at him. "Talk to the receptionist," he muttered and walked away. The receptionist overheard and chuckled, shaking her head. "Told you. You can't just walk in here expecting people to listen to you." The man smiled faintly but said nothing. Just then, another employee, a middle-aged man in a suit, approached the desk. He looked slightly stressed, adjusting his tie as he spoke. "I need to drop this off for Mr. Reynolds," he said, handing the receptionist a file. She barely glanced at it. "Leave it on the desk. It's urgent." She sighed dramatically. "Fine, I'll make sure it gets to him." But the moment he walked away, she shoved the file aside without even looking at it. The man watching all of this had seen enough. He stood up and walked back toward the receptionist's desk. She rolled her eyes. Sir, I already told you, no walk-ins. He didn't interrupt her. He simply leaned on the counter, looking at her in a way that made her shift uncomfortably. You enjoy your job? He asked casually. She frowned. Excuse me? This job. Do you enjoy it? She scoffed. What kind of question is that? An important one. The receptionist narrowed her eyes. Listen, I don't have time for this. If you don't leave soon, I'll have security remove you. The man held up his hands. No problem. I'll wait. And he did. He stepped back, leaning against a nearby pillar, watching as employees passed him by without a second glance. It was fascinating. How easy it was to judge someone based on appearance alone. How quickly people assumed who was important and who wasn't. The receptionist whispered something to a nearby security guard, motioning toward him. The guard nodded and approached. Sir, I need to ask you to leave, he said. The man smiled. Sure, I'll go. Just one question first. The guard hesitated. What is it? The man's eyes darkened slightly. Would you have asked me to leave if I was wearing a suit? The guard froze. The receptionist blinked, suddenly realizing something wasn't right. And then, before either of them could respond, a senior executive happened to walk by, and stopped dead in his tracks the moment he saw the man. His face paled. His breath hitched. The entire atmosphere in the lobby shifted in an instant. The receptionist frowned. What? What's wrong? The executive swallowed hard, his eyes wide with disbelief. Sir, he breathed. And in that moment, everything changed. The air in the lobby suddenly felt heavy. The senior executive's face drained of color as he stared at the man standing in front of the reception desk. His hands twitched slightly, as if unsure whether to adjust his tie or rub his temples. The receptionist looked at him, confused. Do you know this guy? She asked, her tone still dismissive. The executive didn't answer her. Instead, he took a slow, careful step forward. Sir, he said again, this time louder, his voice filled with something dangerously close to fear. What are you doing here? The receptionist's eyebrows pulled together. She glanced between the two men, her expression growing uncertain. Wait. What do you mean, sir? She let out a nervous laugh. Who is he? The executive ignored her. His entire focus was on the man standing in front of him. The man, still calm and unreadable, tilted his head slightly. I was just leaving. Apparently, walk-ins aren't welcome here. The executive swallowed hard. He stopped himself, visibly panicking. That's not true, sir. If we had known, the man raised an eyebrow. If you had known what? The executive opened his mouth, then closed it again. The receptionist was starting to look uncomfortable. Okay, what is going on? She demanded. Who is this guy? For the first time, the man turned his full attention to her. His voice remained polite, but there was something sharp underneath his words. You don't recognize me, do you? The receptionist scoffed. Why would I? I've never seen you before in my life. A long silence stretched between them. Then the man smiled. It was a slow, knowing smile, the kind that made her stomach twist in sudden unease. The executive finally broke. He cleared his throat, his voice shaking slightly. He's the CEO. The receptionist's entire body went stiff. For a full 5 seconds, she didn't move. Didn't even breathe. Then, as if someone had pressed rewind on the last hour, her entire demeanor shifted. Oh. Oh my God, I didn't realize. She stood up so fast her chair nearly toppled over. Her tone transformed instantly, all arrogance wiped away. Sir, I didn't know it was you. The CEO's expression didn't change. He simply watched her, waiting. I thought you were, she stammered. Someone unimportant, he finished for her. The receptionist's mouth opened, then closed. Her face had gone completely pale. I am so sorry, she blurted out. It was a mistake, sir. I didn't mean to. The CEO let out a quiet hum. He didn't look angry. He didn't even look surprised. If anything, he looked disappointed. That's the problem, he said softly. The receptionist blinked. Sir? The CEO turned slightly, his gaze sweeping over the lobby, the employees walking around, the security guard who had been ready to escort him out, the receptionist who had judged him in an instant. This wasn't just about me, he said, his voice calm but cold. You treat people based on what they look like, not who they are. The receptionist's hands shook. Sir, please, I can explain, but the CEO had already started walking away. I'll see you soon, he said over his shoulder. The receptionist didn't understand what that meant. But she would. Very soon. Here is part 4 of your story. The CEO walked past the stunned receptionist, his footsteps calm and measured. The entire lobby had gone silent. Employees who had ignored him before now watched in hushed terror, whispering among themselves. The senior executive quickly followed, walking slightly behind him, his hands fidgeting nervously. Sir, I had no idea you were coming in today. The CEO glanced at him. That's the point, isn't it? The executive swallowed hard. Sir? I came as an ordinary man. And I was treated like I was nothing. The CEO's voice remained calm, but there was a sharpness beneath it that sent chills through the executive. Is that how we operate now? Judging worth by appearance? The executive shook his head quickly. No, sir, of course not. This was a mistake. The CEO stopped walking. He turned, his eyes locking onto the executive. A mistake, he repeated. The executive hesitated. Yes, sir. Just an unfortunate misunderstanding. The CEO studied him for a long moment. The silence stretched so uncomfortably that the executive began to sweat. Then, the CEO looked around at the employees watching the scene unfold. Tell me, he said, his voice carrying through the lobby. How many of you have seen someone treated like I was today? How many times has this happened before? No one answered. People shifted uncomfortably, avoiding his gaze. Some glanced at the receptionist, who stood frozen behind her desk, her hands clenched together. The CEO nodded slowly. I see. He continued walking, this time heading deeper into the building. The executive rushed to keep up. Sir, please, I assure you, this is not a reflection of our company's values. The CEO let out a quiet chuckle. Not a reflection? He gestured to the employees still staring at them. Then tell me, why does no one seem surprised? The executive's throat went dry. The CEO stepped into the nearest hallway, where lower-level employees worked at their desks, focused on their screens. The moment they noticed him, they stiffened. Some quickly minimized their screens, pretending to look busy. Others straightened their backs, suddenly hyper-aware of their posture. It was an entirely different reaction than what he had received in the lobby. And that told him everything he needed to know. A janitor, an older man with kind eyes, walked past, pushing a cleaning cart. He gave the CEO a polite nod, as if greeting any other worker. The CEO stopped him. Good morning. The janitor blinked, a little surprised. Morning, sir. The CEO smiled slightly. How long have you been working here? Nearly 10 years, sir. The executive tensed beside him. The CEO nodded. And in those 10 years, have you ever seen the receptionist treat someone the way she treated me today? The janitor hesitated. Then, with quiet honesty, he nodded. Yes, sir. Many times. The executive inhaled sharply. The CEO's expression didn't change. He simply patted the janitor's shoulder. Thank you for your honesty. The janitor gave him a respectful nod and continued on his way. The CEO then turned back to the executive. still think this was a mistake? The executive looked down, shame washing over his face. The CEO let out a slow breath. Find out how deep this problem goes. I want a full report on how employees, clients, and visitors are treated in this company. The executive nodded quickly. Of course, sir. Right away. The CEO turned away, heading toward the elevator. But as he did, he murmured under his breath, if people think they can treat others this way just because they look unimportant, it's time they learn otherwise. The CEO stepped into the elevator, his expression unreadable. As the door slid shut, he took a slow breath, letting the silence settle. Everything he had seen today confirmed what he had feared. The company he had built with his own hands had changed. The values he had set, the culture he had envisioned, had eroded. And worst of all, no one had even noticed. The doors opened to the executive floor. The receptionist here greeted him with a bright smile, standing up immediately. Good morning, sir. Would you like coffee? She asked eagerly, her tone filled with respect. The CEO gave a small smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. No, thank you. She nodded quickly and sat back down, still watching him as if he were royalty. He walked past her, stepping into the large boardroom where his top executives were already gathered. They stood when he entered, a few clearing their throats nervously. Some of them had already heard whispers of what had happened downstairs. He took his seat at the head of the table. I assume some of you know why I called this meeting, he said, his voice calm yet heavy. A few exchanged glances. One of them, an older man with silver-rimmed glasses, hesitated before speaking. We heard there was an incident in the lobby? The CEO let out a quiet chuckle. An incident? He leaned forward. That's an interesting word for what happened. Silence fell over the room. He glanced around, his gaze sharp. I walked into my own company today. No security. No assistance. No expensive suit. He let the words settle before continuing, and I was treated like a nobody. A few executives shifted uncomfortably. The CEO turned his gaze to one of them. Tell me something, how often do you think this happens? The executive opened his mouth, then closed it. The CEO's voice remained steady. A janitor I spoke to told me that disrespect like this happens all the time. Murmurs spread across the room. Some executives looked genuinely shocked. Others, however, seemed uneasy, like they had known, but had simply ignored it. The CEO leaned back in his chair. Let me ask all of you this, how many talented employees have we lost because of this culture? How many clients turned away? How many partnerships have we never even had the chance to make because someone like that receptionist decided they weren't worth her time? A younger executive, one of the few who still seemed idealistic, spoke up. Sir, this is unacceptable. We need to do something. The CEO nodded. We will do something. He paused for a moment before continuing. Effective immediately, we are implementing undercover evaluations across all departments. Anonymous clients, job applicants, and lower-level employees will be observed to see how they are treated. His voice sharpened. And anyone caught treating people the way I was treated today will face the consequences. Some executives paled. One of them, a woman with neatly pinned hair, frowned. Sir, isn't that a bit extreme? The CEO's gaze turned ice cold. Extreme, he repeated. You think respect is extreme? The room went completely silent. The CEO took a slow breath, then continued, anyone who has a problem with this should ask themselves why. If you think treating people fairly is an inconvenience, then maybe you are part of the problem. The executives glanced at one another, but no one spoke. After a long pause, the CEO stood up. This company will be better than this. I will make sure of it. And with that, he walked out of the boardroom, leaving them to think about what had just happened. Downstairs, the receptionist sat stiffly at her desk, her face pale. Because she knew, her time was running out. Here is part 6 of your story. The CEO stepped out of the boardroom, his mind racing. The quiet hum of the office floor seemed different now, as if every employee had already heard what had happened. Some glanced at him with nervous curiosity, while others pretended to be focused on their screens, avoiding eye contact. He knew change wouldn't come easy. People were comfortable in their habits. But today had been a wake-up call, and not just for them, but for him too. Walking toward his office, he spotted the same janitor from earlier wiping down a nearby counter. The man glanced up, surprised to see the CEO again. "You're still working hard," the CEO said, stopping beside him. The janitor chuckled. "No rest for the weary." The CEO leaned against the counter, watching him for a moment. "Can I ask you something?" The janitor nodded. "Of course, sir." The CEO hesitated before speaking. "If someone like me had never come down to see what was really happening, would anyone have ever spoken up?" The janitor exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "Sir, people like me, we learn to keep our heads down. When we see things, we pretend we don't. Because the moment we speak up, we're seen as troublemakers." He shook his head. "And troublemakers don't last long in places like this." The CEO let those words settle. They weighed on him more than he expected. Finally, he nodded. "That's going to change." The janitor smiled faintly but said nothing. Just then, an assistant rushed up to the CEO, looking flustered. "Sir, the receptionist from the lobby, she's asking to speak with you." The CEO glanced toward the elevator. He had been expecting this. "Send her up," he said. Minutes later, the elevator doors slid open, and the receptionist stepped out. She no longer carried the arrogance she had displayed earlier. Her shoulders were hunched, her hands wringing together. She walked hesitantly toward his office, her confidence shattered. "Sir," she started nervously. I just wanted to apologize." The CEO gestured to a chair in front of his desk. "Sit." She obeyed quickly, her face pale. For a long moment, he didn't speak. He simply studied her, letting the silence stretch. Then, finally, he asked, "Do you know why you're here?" She swallowed hard. "Because I was rude to you, sir." He tilted his head slightly. "Only to me?" She hesitated. The CEO sighed. "Let me ask you something. If I had actually been a struggling job applicant today, would you have apologized?" The receptionist flinched, but she didn't answer. He nodded. "That's what I thought." She looked down, her fingers tightening on the fabric of her skirt. "I didn't think about it that way." "No, you didn't," he agreed. "And that's the problem." Silence settled over the room. The receptionist bit her lip. "Sir, are you going to fire me?" The CEO leaned back in his chair. "What do you think?" She opened her mouth to protest but stopped herself. She saw something in his expression, he wasn't bluffing. She had no other option. Slowly, she nodded. "I'll do it." The CEO nodded once. "Then we'll see if you mean it." She stood up and left, her entire world turned upside down. The CEO watched her go, then turned to look out the window of his office. This was only the beginning. The next morning, the receptionist stood near the janitor's cart, her arms crossed tightly as if hugging herself. She wore a plain uniform now, one she had never imagined herself in. Gone were her perfectly polished nails and the heels she used to click purposefully across the marble floor. The janitor gave her a small nod. "Ready?" She forced a weak smile, but inside, she felt humiliated. She had gone from sitting behind a desk, controlling the flow of visitors, to wiping down countertops. It wasn't fair. Or at least, that's what she thought. As the hours passed, she moved around the building, watching the office from a completely different angle. No longer the polished face of the company, she now blended into the background, just another worker, easily overlooked. For the first time, she felt what it was like to be invisible. She carried cleaning supplies, wiped fingerprints off glass doors, and picked up trash left behind by the very same executives she used to greet with smiles. And she saw things she had never noticed before. A lower-level employee, someone she had ignored countless times, struggled to carry a stack of files. Not a single person offered to help. A young intern spilled her coffee in the break room, her hands shaking. An executive scoffed, muttering, "Typical," before walking past her without a second glance. The receptionist felt something stir inside her, something uncomfortable. Had she been like this? Had she been just as cold? Then, the final blow came. During a break, she overheard two employees near the elevator whispering about her. "She deserves it," one said, shaking her head. "She acted like she was above everyone. Bet she never thought she'd be wiping tables." The other laughed. "I wonder if she'll quit before the week is over." The receptionist's heart sank. Was that really how people saw her? Had she built such a bad reputation that no one even wanted her to succeed? She suddenly realized what the CEO had done. This wasn't just a punishment. It was a test. And for the first time, she saw the company, not from the top down, but from the bottom up. By the end of the day, she was exhausted. She slumped against the janitor's cart, rubbing her sore hands. The janitor chuckled. "Not so easy, is it?" She let out a tired breath. "I never knew," he nodded. "Most don't. Until it happens to them." She looked at him, truly seeing him for the first time. "How do you do it? Stay kind? When people treat you like you don't matter?" He smiled. "Because I know who I am. Doesn't matter how they see me." The receptionist swallowed, his words hitting her harder than she expected. For the first time in years, she wasn't just hearing, she was listening. And deep inside, something started to change. Here is part 8 of your story. Days turned into weeks, and the receptionist continued working under the janitor's supervision. At first, she moved stiffly, still carrying the weight of her past arrogance. But as time went on, something inside her shifted. She no longer rushed through tasks with frustration. She started noticing things: how employees ignored the cleaning staff, how people avoided eye contact with lower-level workers, how some spoke down to those they believed were beneath them. She felt it now. The same cold treatment she had once given to others. One afternoon, she found herself in the break room, wiping down a table when a junior employee hesitated at the entrance. She recognized him. He had once asked her a question at the front desk, and she had brushed him off without a second thought. This time, she looked up and gave him a small smile. "Hey. Need something?" The employee blinked in surprise. "Oh, yeah. I was looking for a clean mug." She pointed toward the cabinet. "Second shelf." He nodded, still looking at her like he was trying to understand what had changed. And maybe she was trying to understand it, too. Later that day, the CEO happened to walk past the hall where she was dusting a shelf. He paused, watching her quietly. She felt his presence before she saw him. Slowly, she turned, her heart pounding. "Sir," she said quickly, standing up straight. The CEO crossed his arms. "How's it going?" She hesitated before answering. "It's different." His gaze was unreadable. "And what have you learned?" She bit her lip, looking down at the cloth in her hands. "I was blind before," she admitted softly. "I only saw people based on their position, not who they were. I treated some with respect because I thought they deserved it, and others like they didn't matter." She swallowed hard. "But I was wrong." The CEO studied her for a long moment. Then, he nodded. "Good." Her eyes widened slightly. "Good?" His voice remained steady. "Realizing your mistake is the first step." She expected him to walk away, to tell her time was over. But instead, he continued watching her, as if waiting for something more. And then it hit her. This wasn't just about learning a lesson. It was about proving she had changed. She had one last chance. She took a breath. "Sir, can I stay?" The CEO raised an eyebrow. She straightened her back. Not as a receptionist. Not in my old position. I mean, can I stay and actually work? Learn from the ground up. Learn how to treat people right. For the first time, the CEO's expression softened. Let's see if your actions match your words, he said. And with that, he walked away, leaving her standing there, knowing that her real test had only just begun. Here is part 9, the final part of your story. Weeks passed. The receptionist, no, the former receptionist, continued working under the janitor's supervision. But now, it wasn't just about completing tasks. It was about understanding. She no longer looked at people the way she once had. She saw things differently now. She noticed the tired eyes of lower-level employees who felt unseen, the cautious smiles of workers who had been dismissed too many times before. And more importantly, she noticed herself. She was no longer the woman who sat behind the desk, deciding who was important based on their clothes. She was someone new. Someone better. One morning, as she wiped down the reception desk, her old desk, a young woman hesitantly stepped forward. "Excuse me," the woman said nervously. I have an interview today, but I think I'm at the wrong place. I'm not sure where to go." The former receptionist paused. This moment felt eerily familiar. A few months ago, she would have dismissed this woman instantly, barely offering a second glance. But not today. She turned fully to the woman, giving her a warm smile. "No worries. Let me check for you." She walked around the desk and pulled up the company's digital directory, helping the woman find her way. "Thank you," the woman breathed in relief. The former receptionist nodded. "Good luck on your interview." The woman smiled. "I really appreciate it." As she walked away, a deep sense of pride settled in the former receptionist's chest. She had no grand title, no power, no authority. But for the first time, she felt something she had never truly felt before, **** respect, ****, not the kind that came from fear. Not the kind that came from status. But the kind that came from doing the right thing. 1 week later, ***, the CEO sat in his office, reviewing reports from the undercover evaluations. He had expected problems. He had expected resistance. But what he hadn't expected was real change. Employees who had once turned away from struggling coworkers were now stepping up. Executives were holding open discussions about respect in the workplace. Even the janitorial staff, who had always been overlooked, were now being acknowledged in ways they never had been before. And at the heart of it all was her. The former receptionist. She had stayed. She had worked. And she had proven that change wasn't just about words, it was about action. A soft knock on his office door pulled him from his thoughts. "Come in," he said. The door opened, and the former receptionist stepped inside. She looked different now, more confident, but not in the way she had been before. This confidence wasn't about power. It was about purpose. "Sir," she said, standing tall. He gestured for her to sit. "You've done well." She exhaled, almost as if she hadn't been sure what he would say. "Thank you." The CEO leaned back in his chair, watching her. "You understand now, don't you?" She nodded. Respect isn't about titles. It's about how we treat people. A small smile touched the CEO's lips. "You've earned your place here," he said. "And now, I have an offer for you." Her eyebrows lifted in surprise. "An offer?" He slid a document across the desk. "A new position. A role designed not for her past mistakes, but for her future growth." Her hand shook slightly as she picked up the document, reading the title. Employee Relations Coordinator. A job where she wouldn't just sit behind a desk anymore. A job where she would help make sure no one was ever treated the way she had treated people before. Her eyes lifted to meet his. "You really believe in second chances, don't you?" she asked quietly. The CEO nodded. Only for those who earn them. She swallowed the lump in her throat, then smiled. Then I won't waste mine.